New Year's Eve isn't just about celebrations. It's when the veil between worlds thins. From eerie visitors to cursed moments, these scary New Year stories will haunt your midnight. Before we dive into these terrifying, scary New Year stories, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more chilling tales, and let us know in the comments. What's the scariest thing that's ever happened to you on New Year's Eve? I never believed in the supernatural until I experienced it for myself. New Year's Eve had always been a night of celebration for me, filled with laughter, fireworks, and promises of a fresh start. But that night, everything changed. It was just after midnight when the strange noises began. I had been alone at home, nursing a drink and scrolling through my phone, when I heard a faint tapping at the window. I froze, thinking it was a branch, but there was no wind. The tapping grew louder, closer. I told myself it was nothing, just a figment of my overactive imagination. But then the glass rattled. I stood up, my heart pounding. My first instinct was to check the front door, but something kept me rooted in place. I crept toward the window, my pulse racing with each step. The outside was blanketed in snow, an eerie silence hanging in the air. No footprints, no movement. But the tapping continued, and now it was accompanied by a low, guttural sound. I stared into the darkness, my breath catching in my throat. There, in the reflection of the glass, I saw it. A figure, barely visible, standing just out of view. It was tall, hunched, with glowing red eyes that pierced through the night. But then, the tapping stopped. I waited for what felt like an eternity, unable to move or look away from the reflection. The figure was gone, but the unease remained. I turned away from the window, convinced it was just my mind playing tricks. But as I glanced at the clock, my heart skipped a beat. It was 12:15 a.m. How long had I been standing there? I tried to shake it off, but something in the air felt wrong. The silence outside was too deep, too unnatural. I picked up my phone, hoping to distract myself. But then I saw a message. It was from an unknown number. "You shouldn't be alone tonight." I dropped the phone, my hands trembling. I rushed to lock every door, every window. But as I moved from room to room, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The footprints in the snow outside my window. They were leading toward my front door. But then I heard the sound of a door creaking open. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it, or if the house itself was alive with some malevolent force. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, as if they were waiting for something to emerge. I turned toward the staircase, my mind racing, and that's when I heard it. A voice, barely a whisper, but clear as day. "You shouldn't have looked." I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I bolted toward the door, ready to escape. But as I opened it, I found myself face to face with the figure, standing right there in front of me. Its eyes glowed brighter now, and the air around it crackled with something ancient, something dangerous. It smiled. Then, everything went black. When I awoke, it was morning. The sunlight spilled into the room, and for a moment, I wondered if it had all been a dream. But then I noticed the snow outside the window. It was undisturbed, except for one set of footprints leading up to my door, and the phone in my hand still displayed the message. "You shouldn't be alone tonight." To this day, I can't shake the feeling that something is still watching me, waiting for me to be alone again. I always hated New Year's Eve. It wasn't the fireworks or the crowds, but the feeling that something strange always happened, something that left me with a nagging sense of dread. This year was no different. I had decided to spend the evening at the old church on the hill. It was far from the usual hustle and bustle, a quiet place to reflect before the new year. The heavy wooden doors creaked as I entered, the scent of old wood and incense lingering in the air. It was the perfect sanctuary for someone looking to escape the chaos. I sat near the back, the large stained glass windows casting multicolored light across the pews. Everything felt peaceful. Too peaceful. The church bell tower loomed above me, its old bells a reminder of the time that passed. But then, just as the clock struck midnight, the bell rang. It wasn't a single chime as I had expected. It was 7. I glanced up at the bell tower, confused. The bell hadn't rung for years. The church had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. Still, I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. But then, I heard footsteps. I stood up, heart pounding in my chest, straining to hear. It wasn't the sound of rats or creaking wood. These were heavy footsteps, deliberate, echoing through the empty church. I looked around, expecting to see someone standing in the shadows, but the pews were empty, the air still. I moved cautiously toward the front, my footsteps echoing in the silence. That's when I saw it. A figure standing in front of the altar. But then, the figure turned toward me. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. Its face was obscured by a dark hood, but I could make out the faint glow of eyes, hollow and endless. Its long fingers reached toward me, the nails sharp and unnatural, scraping across the stone floor. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it took a step forward, the floor groaning under its weight. I took a step back, but my legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot. And then, it spoke. "Every year, it's the same." Its voice was low, gravelly, like the sound of stones grinding together. "But you're different." I felt a cold rush of fear, a chill that seeped into my very bones. "What do you mean?" I asked, barely able to speak. It didn't answer right away. It tilted its head, studying me like a predator sizing up its prey. Then, with a voice that sent shivers down my spine, it said, "You shouldn't be here. Not tonight." I turned to run, but the church doors slammed shut with a force that rattled the entire building. The figure was closer now, its glowing eyes never leaving mine. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. The cold air remained, the silence ringing in my ears. I stood there, frozen, wondering if I had imagined the whole thing. But then, I glanced up at the bell tower again. The bells were still. No sound. But beneath the silence, there was something else, something far worse. The sound of footsteps, approaching from behind. I never took the midnight train on New Year's Eve. It seemed like a strange tradition, something reserved for people who wanted to be somewhere else, anywhere but where they were. But this year, something was different. I had missed the last bus and decided to take the train instead. The station was empty, save for a few scattered figures. The air was heavy with the scent of wet pavement and cold steel. The train wasn't due for another 15 minutes, but I was already staring at the tracks, waiting. And then, just as the clock struck midnight, I heard it. The sound of a train. But it wasn't the train I was expecting. It was louder, closer. And there was no whistle, no screeching of the brakes as it approached, just the sound of metal on metal, getting closer, faster. I looked around, but the platform was empty. No other passengers, no sign of a conductor. Just me and the sound of the train. But then, I saw it. At the far end of the platform, a train appeared. It was unlike any I had ever seen before, old, rusted, and covered in grime. Its windows were dark, the doors shut tight. The train was moving too fast, as if it were running on some unseen force, its wheels grinding against the rails. I thought about running, but something kept me rooted to the spot. The train was coming, and there was no escape. I stood there, my heart racing, watching as it drew closer. But then, something strange happened. The train slowed just as it reached the end of the platform, coming to a complete stop. The doors creaked open. I hesitated, wondering if I should get on. But then, a voice called out from the darkness. "You're late." I froze. The voice was soft, almost too soft, like a whisper carried on the wind. I turned to see a figure standing at the edge of the platform, cloaked in shadows. It was a man, or something that looked like one. His face was obscured by a dark hood, but his eyes gleamed with an unnatural light. "You've missed the last train," he said, his voice low and cold. I didn't know what to say, but I felt a strange pull to step onto the train. Something inside me was telling me that this was my only chance, that I couldn't leave just yet. I took a step forward, but then the doors slammed shut. The train lurched, its wheels grinding again, but this time it was moving backward, away from the station. I looked out the window, and everything around me blurred. The lights of the station faded, replaced by the dark, empty night. The city disappeared. But then, I realized something. The train wasn't headed to any station I knew. The tracks curved into a vast, endless tunnel, stretching into the abyss. The sound of the train's wheels was deafening, echoing off the walls of the tunnel. I turned to the figure who had spoken. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer, his face finally visible in the dim light. His eyes, they were hollow, black, endless. "Where you've always belonged," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The train picked up speed, rushing into the dark. I tried to scream, but the words stuck in my throat. I looked out the window again, but the world outside had vanished. There was only darkness and the sound of the train. And then, everything went silent. The train stopped, and I was alone. The doors opened, and I stepped off the train, into a place that wasn't real. To this day, I don't know what happened that night, or if it even really happened. But I haven't seen a train since, and sometimes when I stand on a platform late at night, I hear the sound of metal on metal, getting closer. I've always been a skeptic. Ghosts, spirits, things that go bump in the night. None of it ever made sense to me. That was until last New Year's Eve, when everything I thought I knew was turned upside down. It was a quiet evening, nothing out of the ordinary. The city had its usual buzz, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses drifting through the night air. I had decided to spend the night at home, alone, reflecting on the past year. I wasn't one for big celebrations, preferring the solitude of my small apartment. As midnight approached, I stood by the bathroom sink, brushing my teeth. The hum of the clock on the wall grew louder, more insistent, the seconds ticking down to the new year. I barely noticed the strange sensation creeping over me, like I was being watched. But then, as I looked into the bathroom mirror, I saw it, a figure standing behind me. I spun around quickly, my heart thumping in my chest. But the bathroom was empty, just me, alone in the reflection. My breath was ragged, my mind racing. I glanced back at the mirror. Nothing. I chalked it up to the shadows playing tricks on my eyes. But then, just as the clock struck midnight, I saw it again. In the reflection, a figure stood just behind me, tall and cloaked in darkness. I could see no details, just the outline of something unnatural. My own face stared back at me, frozen in place, my eyes wide with terror. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. But no one answered. The figure simply remained in the mirror, unmoving, as if it were waiting for something. Then, slowly, it smiled. The smile was wide, grotesque, its teeth sharp and white against the darkness of its face. I stumbled back, nearly falling over the bathroom counter. But when I turned to leave the room, the reflection of my back remained in the mirror, as if I hadn't moved at all. I stared at the mirror, my pulse pounding in my ears. The figure didn't move, but something was wrong. Something wasn't right about it. It wasn't just standing there. It was watching me, waiting. I took a hesitant step forward and placed my hand on the mirror. The surface felt cold, unnaturally cold. A chill ran through my fingers, all the way up to my arm, and that's when it happened. The figure's hand appeared, pressed against the glass on the other side of mine. The reflection of its fingers was distorted, as though it were pressing through the mirror itself, reaching for me. I yanked my hand away, stumbling backward. "What do you want?" I gasped, my voice barely a whisper, but there was no response. The figure didn't speak, but I could feel its presence growing stronger, more oppressive. I was trapped in my own reflection. Then, I noticed something even more terrifying. In the reflection, my own eyes, were not looking at the mirror. They were looking at something behind me, something real, something that wasn't in the mirror. I turned slowly, dread flooding my chest. Standing there, in the doorway of the bathroom, was the same figure. Its face was pale and smooth, and its eyes, dark, empty voids. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. It was like I was frozen, caught in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The figure stepped forward, its face twisting into a smile as it reached out toward me. But then, just as it touched my shoulder, everything went black. I woke up hours later, disoriented, on the bathroom floor. The clock on the wall had stopped. I looked into the mirror. My reflection was the same, just me, alone. But the figure was gone. Or was it? As I left the bathroom, I glanced back at the mirror. And there, in the reflection, I saw it again. The figure standing just behind me, smiling. And this time, it wasn't just the reflection. It was real. I had always thought New Year's Eve was just another night, nothing more than a change of the calendar, an excuse for parties and fireworks. But that night was different. It started when I was walking home from a friend's party. I'd had a bit to drink, and the streets were nearly empty, save for the occasional car passing by. The usual noise of the city was quieter than normal, almost as if the world had paused for the final hour of the year. As I passed the old clock tower, I glanced up at the time. 11:58 p.m. The chimes would ring soon, marking the end of one year and the beginning of the next. But then, something caught my attention. The clock stopped. I blinked, sure I was just seeing things. But no, the hands were frozen. 11:58, perfectly still. I stepped closer to the tower. My curiosity piqued. The minute hand barely moved, but it didn't seem right. I turned to the streetlights, the shadows stretching unnaturally in the dark. The night had gone too quiet, too still. I pulled out my phone to check the time, but the screen was black. No notifications, no signal. I tried to call someone, anyone, but it was as if the entire world had shut down. No response. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as though something was holding its breath. I heard footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, expecting to see another late-night walker or a passing car. But no one was there. The street was empty. The only sound was the distant hum of the city, muted and far away. I shook it off, thinking I was just being paranoid, but then the footsteps came again, closer this time. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was nothing, just the quiet, empty street. I took a step forward, trying to shake the feeling that something was wrong, but the footsteps followed me. Each step seemed heavier than the last, as if the air itself was pressing down on me. The sensation of being watched, hunted, crept up my spine. Then, the clock tower struck midnight. The sound was deafening, the bells ringing louder than I had ever heard before. The noise felt like it was coming from inside my head, a deep, resonating chime that reverberated through the entire street. But as the bells rang, the world around me seemed to warp. The lights flickered, the ground beneath my feet wavered. I staggered back, trying to make sense of what was happening, but nothing felt real anymore. The streets, the buildings, the very air, all of it seemed to bend and distort. And then I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the street. It was tall, shadowed with no distinct features, just a dark silhouette against the shimmering light. The figure didn't move, didn't even blink. It just stood there, watching me, as if waiting for something. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. My legs felt like they were made of stone, frozen in place. The figure took a step forward, and with it, the world around me shifted again. The clock tower, the street lights, the ground, all warped in an impossible way, like a nightmare I couldn't escape. And then, the figure spoke. "You should never have been here," it said, its voice a low whisper, like the sound of wind through dry leaves. The words sent a chill through my body, colder than the air around me. I wanted to ask who it was, what it wanted, but the words wouldn't come. The figure stepped closer, its shape becoming more defined as it reached out, its hand inches from my face. I closed my eyes, expecting to feel its touch, but instead, everything stopped. The world, the sounds, the cold air, all of it ceased. The silence was deafening. I opened my eyes, and the street was back to normal. The clock tower was ticking away, the lights shining brightly above, the hum of the city returning to its usual rhythm. But when I looked at my phone, I saw it. The time had stopped at 11:59 p.m. The hour I had lost was gone. And as I walked home, something told me that no matter how many years passed, that hour would never return. The clock tower would never truly tick again for me. The night had swallowed it whole. And somewhere, in the shadows, I could still hear the footsteps behind me. I had always dismissed New Year's Eve as a pointless occasion. The countdown, the cheers, the resolutions, it all felt so shallow to me. I preferred the quiet of my apartment, alone with my thoughts, away from the chaos. This year, though, something was different. I don't know why, but I had an overwhelming urge to stay home, away from the usual parties. The clock had just hit 11:45 p.m. when I received the call. I glanced at my phone, and the number was unfamiliar. No name, just a string of random digits. I thought about ignoring it, but something compelled me to answer. Maybe it was the strange feeling in the pit of my stomach, the eerie calm that had settled over the room, as if the night itself was holding its breath. I picked up the phone. "Hello?" There was a pause, an unnerving silence on the other end. Then a voice, low and deliberate, spoke. "Don't open the door." My heart skipped a beat. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice shaky. "What do you want?" The voice was cold, almost mechanical. "It's already too late. Don't open the door." I glanced toward the front door, confused and uneasy. It was locked, just as it had been all night. I didn't recognize the voice, and there was no reason why anyone would be at my door. Still, the feeling of dread intensified. I pressed my back against the couch, my mind racing. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my hand shaking as I held the phone. "What's happening?" The voice was softer now, almost like a whisper. "The countdown is nearly over. You won't survive the hour." My breath caught in my throat. The time on my phone read 11:55 p.m. It was nearly midnight, the final moments of the year. Then, before I could say another word, the line went dead. I stared at my phone, my hand still gripping it tightly. What had just happened? Who was that? Why did they tell me not to open the door? I shook my head, trying to rationalize it. It was probably just a prank. But the feeling in my chest wouldn't go away. The air around me seemed thicker now, colder. I stood up, pacing the living room, trying to shake the anxiety. Suddenly, I heard a faint knock at the door. It was so soft I almost thought I imagined it, but then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. 3 soft raps, like a rhythm, a countdown of its own. My heart began to race. The voice from the phone echoed in my mind. "Don't open the door." I crept cautiously toward the door, my breath shallow, my hands clammy. I looked through the peephole. There was no one, just darkness. I stood there, frozen, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Every instinct told me to turn away, to ignore it, to stay inside. but something inside me told me to open it to see who, or what, was out there. The knocking stopped. I hesitated, caught between fear and curiosity. But then, just as I reached for the handle, the phone rang again, the same unknown number. My pulse quickened as I answered it, my voice trembling. "Hello." The voice, the same chilling tone as before, spoke with urgency. "Don't open the door. It's not a person out there. It's something else. It's coming for you." I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. Something inside me screamed to listen, to stay away. But before I could react, the knocking came again, louder, more insistent. Knock, knock, knock. I rushed to the window, pulling the blinds aside to look outside. But there was nothing, just the empty street, bathed in the glow of streetlights, untouched by the night's chaos. No one was there. And then the lights flickered. The room plunged into darkness for a split second, and when the lights came back on, something had changed. The air felt heavier, charged with an unnatural energy. The knocking stopped, but in its place, a voice spoke. It wasn't from the phone. It wasn't even from outside. It was inside the room with me. "I warned you," the voice said. A cold, metallic tone that sent ice through my veins. I turned around, my breath ragged, eyes darting across the room. But there was no one, just the empty walls, the silence pressing down on me. The phone rang again. I didn't answer this time. I couldn't. Something wasn't right. The voice from the phone, the one that had warned me, wasn't human. And that knocking? It wasn't a person at the door. It was a countdown. And in the final moments of the year, I knew that whatever had called me was closer than I realized. Whatever had knocked was no longer outside. It was in the house. I never liked New Year's Eve. There was something about the forced celebration, the expectation to be joyful when all I wanted was peace and quiet. So every year I spent the night at home, curled up with a book, waiting for the clock to strike midnight. This year, though, I felt an unease I couldn't shake off. It was as if the night was waiting for something, or someone. I was sitting on my couch, the soft hum of the television playing in the background, when the knock came. It was sharp, unexpected. 3 quick raps on my front door. I froze, staring at the door as if it might open on its own. No one ever came by on New Year's Eve, let alone at this hour. 10:45 p.m., too early for the night to be over and too late for anyone to be out visiting. I stood up, reluctantly, and approached the door. My hand hovered over the doorknob, but I hesitated. There was no reason to expect anyone. Maybe it was just someone who had the wrong address. But then the knock came again, louder this time. 3 solid bangs, each one echoing in the silence of the night. I opened the door slowly, peeking out into the dimly lit hallway. There was no one, just the empty space in front of me, the faint light from the street lamps outside casting long shadows on the walls. I frowned, about to close the door when I noticed something strange, a small envelope lying on the ground, just at the edge of the doorframe. I bent down and picked it up. The envelope was old-fashioned, cream-colored, with no return address. I turned it over, half expecting it to be addressed to the wrong person, but it wasn't. It had my name on it, in bold, handwritten letters. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. Who would send me something at this hour? Why? What was going on? With trembling hands, I tore open the envelope. Inside, there was a single piece of paper folded neatly. I unfolded it, my heart pounding, and read the message. "You've been waiting for the wrong thing. It's time to greet the new year with a visitor." I felt the blood drain from my face. What did that mean? A visitor? The words seemed so cryptic, like a riddle I didn't understand. And then, just as I was about to close the envelope, I heard it. A faint whisper. coming from inside the apartment. I spun around, my heart racing in my chest, but the apartment was still. The lights flickered above me. My breath hitched, my hands sweating as I looked around. I couldn't see anyone. I was alone. Or so I thought. But then the whispering came again. It was closer this time, faint and soft, as if someone was just behind me. I turned around, my breath catching in my throat. There, standing at the threshold of the living room, was a figure. Tall, cloaked in shadow, the face obscured by the darkness. I could feel its presence, the air around me growing colder with every second. My legs felt like lead as I backed away slowly, my pulse thundering in my ears. Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure didn't answer, but its presence loomed larger, as though it were drawing closer with each passing second. It wasn't a person. It wasn't a friend or a stranger. It was something else, something ancient. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen, my eyes locked on the figure as it stepped forward, its form becoming more defined in the dim light. "Do you remember the past year?" the figure finally asked, its voice low and unsettling, like the wind rustling through dead leaves. "Do you remember everything you've lost? Everything you've forgotten?" I shook my head, confusion swirling in my mind. What was it talking about? And then the figure reached out toward me. Its hand was long, skeletal, fingers twisted unnaturally. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stood there, paralyzed, as the figure's hand brushed my shoulder. The touch was cold, cold to the bone. The moment it made contact, the room seemed to blur. The walls seemed to close in, the space around me distorting, twisting in a way that made my stomach turn. The lights flickered again, brighter this time, and I could feel the pressure of something pressing in on me. "Do you see it now?" the figure asked, its voice sharp, cutting through the air. Suddenly, the walls disappeared. The floor beneath me vanished, and I was falling. Plunging into darkness, I gasped for air, but there was nothing. No sound, no light, just a crushing emptiness. And then, everything stopped. I woke up with a start, my heart pounding, the room around me still. It was midnight. The lights flickered once, then steadied. I was back in my apartment. Everything seemed normal, as though nothing had happened. But when I looked down at the floor, the envelope was there. Again, I reached down, my hands shaking, and picked it up. The message inside was different this time. "The visitor hasn't left. The new year isn't what you think it is." The figure was still here, waiting, and the year had only just begun.